Hello, and welcome to session 13 of Introduction to Design Studies. After the real-time lecture by Chris Wu last week, we'll revert now to the video recording to give you an independent approach to receiving the information by timing the viewing, reading, and contemplating of this lecture at your own leisure, in conjunction, of course, with the timing of your recitation groups, but also to allow you to go forward and backward within the presentation to reread or rethink some of the aspects that you might have found a critical attitude and position to. As usual, we begin with an image of the series of works by YZ, the French street artist that has accompanied this series as a motif from the very beginning. This time, as you can see, the image is not represented as a reproduction of the actual work, but denoted very clearly as part of the information policy that YZ, the artist herself, puts out, namely as a reproduction on her website. Because session 13 is devoted to media and mediation, the way design appears in the media and the way it is mediated from one format and material to another. Let me begin by saying that the way in which design is represented in the media, from printed pictures on posters and magazines, via sound and moving images to digital worlds, is also very much designed. And by saying this, I'm stating the obvious. You know this, and you've been keenly aware of it. But for the sake of this presentation, I would like to prize apart certain elements within this media and mediation of design. So, one could say that the mediation in popular media or subversive media or experimental media is a creative process that takes a design idea and considers, more or less critically, which I think is an important point, its mediation to a public, however large that public might be. So, this is about progressive and critical forms of presenting design in the media through examples, in ways that are seen as congenial and sometimes deliberately contradictory to the initial piece of design, its concepts, its materials, its ideas. As we're talking about media and looking forward to the reading for today, namely Marshall McLuhan's seminal essay, The Medium is the Message, I would like to offer another opener, namely an image of an art and design work by the South Korean artist Namjoon Paik from 1974, and it's entitled TV Buddha. And in a way, you see an assembly of two designed images. The crafted statue of a Buddha, and opposite, a Sony television set from the early 1970s that is displaying the recorded image of the face of the Buddha, who is gazing into its own reflection on the TV screen. And I use this image not only because it's in a way contemporary to Marshall McLuhan. Marshall McLuhan wrote his essay in 1964. Namjoon Paik's TV work and video work starts in that period. The TV Buddha, admittedly, is 10 years later, but could be seen as a direct reflection of the new ideas on media by Marshall McLuhan. And I therefore want to pair this work by Namjoon Paik with a quote from Marshall McLuhan. In a culture like ours, Marshall McLuhan says, long accustomed to splitting and dividing all things as means of control, it is sometimes a bit of a shock to be reminded that, in operational and practical fact, the medium is the message. This is merely to say that the personal and social consequences of any medium, that is, of any extension of ourselves, result from the new scale that is introduced into our affairs by each extension of ourselves or by any new technology. The curious term extension here refers to an earlier book from the late 1950s by Marshall McLuhan about the extension of man, where he sees information technology and, by extension, media as extensions of man. And we will discuss this when we come to another quote by Marshall McLuhan, and I'm sure you can pick this up in the recitation classes. So here we have Marshall McLuhan's famous dictum, the medium is the message. And we have the notion of extending not just our sensorial realm, what we see, what we smell, what we hear, what we speak of, but also our cognitive realm, how we think, what we think, the way in which we process information, extend it through forms of media. In an analogy to the design process, where the designer extends herself or themselves or himself from an initial ideation through iterations and prototypes to a material realization, even if that realization is immaterial in forms of a digital or virtual work that uses information technology and processes, to extend it into a form, into a material form for communication and display, means that this extension is also self-reflexive of the media that she, they, him are using. Let me explain through an initial example. Here is the Madrid-based, now living partly in London, design duo El Último Grito. And I might have mentioned them before because I think they are, for me, a perfect example of innovative design practice that reflects on itself, is critical on itself, displays its own criticism in very innovative forms, also through the way in which they mediate their works. And so what I would like to offer here as a first form of contemplation about the idea of the medium being the message is a film by them entitled A Rematerialization of System. And the subtitle here is Industry. It's part of a three-part series of filmic works, and they all date back to 2013. So consider the title first, Rematerialization, the idea that here we're seeing through a medium a rematerialization. We see a configuration of material, maybe a change of it. And in that respect, while you watch the video, please consider some of these questions. They are not exclusive. You can ask your own questions, of course. But maybe it would be worth pondering, what is the material, as in rematerialization, that is being used here? Or is that too obvious a question? What is the meaning of the work? Or is that too transparent here? Literally, as you can see in the title, it seems descriptive. But what does the medium of the film contribute here to the rendition of the work? How does it change it? Or does it add meaning? Or does it in some way distract? So please pause this presentation, have a look at the video, and then come back to it. Thank you. So, after having watched El Último Grito's film, A Rematerialization Industry, here is a close-up, a photographic close-up of the actual design work that you saw animated in the previous moving images. So, this is one of the first examples that I would like to offer in terms of mediating a work of design, where the mediation, the media is being used, the form, the technique of its presentation plays an important role in adding to the context, meaning, criticism, as I said, El Último Grito is very self-reflexive, of the actual design work. Allow me to suggest another example, also in terms of moving images. Here's a work by by Anthony Dunn and Fiona Raby, entitled Designs for an Overpopulated Planet. This is number 1, entitled Foragers. Again, there are a number of videos, 5 are in existence. They date back to 2010. And what you can see here is an installation shot of objects made for this series, Designs for an Overpopulated Planet, as they were presented in the 12th Triennale of Milano in 2019. And they became part of an exhibition called Broken Nature, Design Takes on Human Survival. But this goes back to last year, as I said, and what I would like you to look at is the actual video, which predates by almost a decade this presentation and exhibition. And maybe there are similar questions to ponder while you watch this video. What does the medium of film contribute to the rendition of the work? Does it change the meaning? Does it add the meaning? Does it distract? How would one perceive the work, encountering it as a display of models at a design fair and exhibition, in contrast to this film that I would invite you to watch now? So think about these things, what the different types of presentation of a design work entail. What do they say when they contextualize a design work made in a studio, perhaps, made through performative exercises, and now being displayed in a museum context, and then being animated through moving images. So enjoy this film, and then please come back to the presentation. So after having seen 2 initial examples and having been acquainted a bit with Marshall McLuhan's ideas of medium as a message, let me propose a few forms in which design can be represented in the media. Of course, needless to say, these forms that I'm proposing are not exhaustive. There are many more to be added, and you might even disagree with some of the categories that I chose. But for the sake of the presentation, I want to add those, and then you can see what is missing, what needs to be changed, and add it. But they provide maybe a kind of structure for considering different forms of representation in the media. So the first way is to represent a design as a beautifully formalized object. But you can also represent design as a working process, as a process of ideation, production, prototyping, realization. The design work, whether it's fully realized or still in process, can become part of a visual narrative or a storyline. You can go away from the integrity of the entire design and home in on a material detail. So here the media focuses on very select aspects of the design, not the entire work. Design can be symbolic and representative for user consumption, as you can see, for example, in advertising, and we'll have a few examples in the end. Or it can appear in a manual as a functional cipher, for example, to construct something that the designer puts before you in elements or components, or that is hinted at as part of an overall configuration that you yourself have to understand and enter into. So it becomes a signifier, part of a sign for a particular way of living with design. So let's go to the series of examples, and I would propose to go through each of these categories with a number of examples. But before I do that, I would want to consider Another quote from today's reading. This comes from the opening of Marshall McLuhan's essay, The Medium is the Message. And I quote, the instance of the electric light may prove illuminating in this connection. Bit of a bad pun, but he was a literary professor from Canada, so his humor is sometimes something to get accustomed to, Marshall McLuhan's. So again, the instance of the electric light may prove illuminating in this connection. The electric light is pure information. It is a medium without a message, as it were, unless it is used to spell out some verbal ad or a name, like a neon sign. This fact, characteristic of all media, means that the content of any medium is always another medium. The content of writing is speech, just as the written word is the content of print, and print is the content of the telegraph. If it is asked, what is the content of speech? It is necessary to say, it is an actual process of thought, which is in itself non-verbal. An abstract painting represents direct manifestation of creative thought processes as they might appear in computer design. What we are considering here, however, are the psychic and social consequences of the designs or patterns as they amplify or accelerate existing processes. For the message of any medium or technology is the change of scale or pace or pattern that it introduces into human affairs. So this is quite a long quote. Let's try and break it down a bit. Two parts of it that I personally find interesting. You might approach this in a different way, but just allow me to go with you here through an exercise and close reading, maybe analytical reading, if that's the right word, and see where we go with it. So two parts of that quote I find quite interesting. The first one is that Marshall McLuhan says that the content of any medium is always another medium. What does that mean? It seems obvious at first, especially in an increasingly complex and interconnected digital culture. Whatever medium you choose, its content is also a medium, whether it's moving images like a GIF, whether it's a meme, whether it is something that is written as a headline or as a comment. So it seems obvious that within every medium resides a content that is also presented in another medium. But what does that element or idea mean for analyzing one particular medium? Can you isolate this medium that you're analyzing without seeing it in relationship to another? Or is it always to be seen as a hierarchy? Speech, writing to computer language, internet. And is it thus the position that a particular media takes in within that relationship of one medium to another, speech to writing to internet, for example, that matters, rather than analyzing the medium in itself? Does it always have to be seen in that contextual relationship as a medium, as a contents of another medium? Is the medium of speech, for example here in this video recording, subservient to the medium of writing? Although I did not script my speech, of course there's a lot of writing presented to you. And is the written word, in turn, as it appears here on the screen, part of the medium of print, as a digital copy that we send out later when we distribute this particular slide presentation? While the medium that we use in order to distribute this or to transport this information, this data, internet, broadband, fiber optic cables, is another medium that needs to be understood as containing the print and the screen. So this is what I meant about the interconnectivity between the different media and their possible positioning in an information hierarchy or in a cultural economic hierarchy. So what about the second part that I considered interesting within that larger quote by Marshall McLuhan. He ends by saying, what are we considering here, however, are the psychic and social consequences of the design or patterns as they amplify or accelerate existing processes. The psychic and social consequences of the design as they amplify or accelerate existing processes. For the message of any medium or technology is the change of scale or pace or pattern that it introduces to human affairs. So message is, he says in the first place, the contents of another medium. You know, the media, any medium can be the contents of another medium. So there's a message inherent in that. But the message of the medium in general is the scale or pace or pattern that it introduces into human affairs. So here, if we break this down, the scale of the design within the media, how widespread and common is it, you know, as in various social media design. The pace could be the pace in which people adopt a medium, but equally the pace in the speed of the medium itself, its inherent tempo, and the speed that is used in distributing information and data through this particular medium. That's also part of the notion of pace. So scale, how widespread, pace, how quick. And then finally pattern, as in repeated actions and reactions that user display in regard to a medium. And simultaneously the social patterns that result from having access or being denied access to a specific medium. And I think this becomes very obvious when we deal with the present situation in which these recordings are communicated through broadband fiber optic cables that not everybody has access to, which means that the data and the information is processed at varying speeds. And that puts certain people at a disadvantage. Not necessarily you for learning, although there is this element, but in larger economic systems, for example. So very early on here, Marshall McLuhan, this is from 1964, analyzes medium in terms of its scale, its pace, and the pattern. And each of these three have a double meaning. And the pattern, the final of those three, can be seen as repeated, as reproduction. Very important. This is something we'll pick up in the very last of our lectures in 2 weeks' time. But also, not just the patterns of reproduction, but also the way in which media produces, reproduces, displays, represents social patterns, economic patterns in society. For example, class conflicts, or gender conflicts, or conflicts of race and ethnicity. These are patterns of behavior that exist across time within different societies, and media represents these patterns. So, to all those three elements, within the message of a medium, scale, pace, and pattern, we have multiple meanings. And I think this makes these quotes, although they date back to 1964, rather productive for analysis. So, I would suggest that you can apply a similar method to Marshall McLuhan's essay. You can pick other quotes, other elements from him, and discuss it in a way. I'm not trying to lead you into only analytical reading of a text. Of course, any text can be read for its verbal and stylistic excellence, for its context, and so on and so forth. In this case, I think it's worth looking at the data and information that is contained within Marshall McLuhan's writing, partly because it is so much about information and data, but also because I think he packs a lot into it. And the prizing apart, the close reading of these quotes really helps, in my view. But back to the examples. So I started with the notion that design is represented in the media as an aesthetic and formal object. And here's a first example that might underscore this. It comes from a hanging scroll from the 1620s, Chinese in origin. And you can see that the piece of design, the beautifully made vase, and arguably other piece of design, you could say the flower arrangement, you could say the basket weaving, and so on and so forth, but mainly in terms of coloration, although this is quite bleached out as a hanging scroll, mainly in terms of coloration, the vase itself, the ceramic vase, is put into the foreground. So you have the original design, the person, the potter who made this beautiful vase, burned it in an oven, lacquered it, put maybe a particular veneer and coloring on it. And this design and this creative work by the designer, by the craftsperson, if you will, there's 1620 for something like this. An art historian would probably use the words craftsperson rather than designer, but that's a moot point maybe. But the work of the designer here is represented as an overall aesthetic vision, augmented and complemented by the way in which the flowers are arranged, by the way in which a silk bow is wrapped around, rather awkwardly, because one would assume it might slip down, the body of the vase, and also by the way in which an arranged still life is placed behind the vase as part of an overall scheme of an aestheticization of nature and, by extension, maybe of life. Another beautifully stylized aestheticization comes here from a photograph of the studio of the great Mali photographer Malik Sidibé from West Africa. And here is a photo very descriptively entitled Three Friends on a Motorbike from 1975. And Sidibé used the setting of his studio in Mali as an arena to present aesthetic configurations, very carefully contrived, with very simple means, as you can see. And the design value here not only lies in the beautifully tailored clothing or the design motorbikes that the three friends, or two of the three friends, have mounted, but also in the way in which the composition is placed in the center, but then framed on the one hand by a curtain, on the other hand by a wall with shadows on it. So there's a kind of centrality to it that is very carefully arranged. And if you think that the genesis of these photographs were actually rather incidental portraits that the people who came into Malik Sidibé's practice asked him to take, then what he developed out of these very simple tasks of accidentally or simply portraying passing strangers becomes even more impressive in the way in which the composition and the styling of these images is achieved. And then finally, and maybe more polemically and also critically, a hyper-stylized, extremely formalized, modernist Western image of utensils, kitchen designs made by Helmut Franke and Helmut Volland of the Bauhaus School in 1955. So here you can see transparency through overlaying of negatives of the photographs allows you for a kind of montage of forms that really brings the stylistic quality of these everyday designs to the fore. So here we have design as mediated as an aesthetic form. What about the documentation of a working process? The second set of examples that I want to provide. Here we have a facsimile made by a British archaeologist of a wall painting from the tomb of Nebamun and Ipuki in the New Kingdom in Egypt before our Common Era, 1390 to 1349, roughly before our Common Era. The frieze that has been copied on tempera and paper with tempera on paper is kept in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Here you can see that this wall painting from the New Kingdom inside a tomb shows the different working processes that craftspeople in Egypt were executing, not only for economic benefit and social progress or technological experimentation, but also, as you can see, to the glory of the ruler god that is sitting on the left. So the work, detailed in technical and material terms, has an overarching idea that producing for the common good, or indeed in this case for the good of the ruler, needs to be shown in all its excellence and detailed laboriously over a long frieze, of which this is only a part, in order to show the range of technical and material abilities that was executed in order to serve this grander political scheme of the pharaohs in Egypt. Another example, this time moving over to Japan and moving to a period of 1857, the mid-19th century, beginning of the Meiji period, Japan opening itself up forcefully because they were pressured to do so by the arrival of the American steamers to the West, and exposing their craftsmanship, their craft traditions, their artistry to the world. This is communicated, mediated, if you will, here by a woodcut by Utaga Kusinada entitled Shokugin, Artisans. And it's a triptych that shows exactly what the medium in which it was executed entails, namely woodcutting. So you see in the idealized, rather cramped confinement of a workshop, a number of artisans, male and female, working together in order to execute prints. This starts with the material of paper that needs to be grounded and prepared. It continues with cutting the woodcut, mixing the colors, coloring the wood, imprinting the paper with the cut wood and the colors. And it does so in not necessarily a linear narrative, but in a kind of circular arrangement that owes more to a formalized aesthetic than to the logic of the production process itself. So it's a curious mix of instructive or didactic in terms of, oh, look, this is how a perfect woodcut is executed. And this indeed is how what you are seeing here as a reproduction of a woodcut, this is how me as the artist, Kunisada, how I arrive at this particular work. This is all the artisanal labor I require in order to create this triptych. But at the same time, the composition of this triptych is so important that the production process is compressed and condensed and loses some of its didactic qualities so as to be able to reproduce the labor, the artisanal work from these images in favor of an arrangement that shows an overall aesthetic vision of which the woodcut could be seen as the final mediatic outcome. Another way of mediating design was, as I mentioned at the beginning in my list, as part of a visual narrative, a storyline. And an obvious way of looking at this is through a comic strip. And here you don't necessarily have the narrative comic of superheroes or Franco-Belgian comics like Tintin or Spirou, but you have a kind of ironic, self-reflective, modernist account of a paneled storyline by the Dutch artist Joost Zwarte. And this was done for the New Yorker magazine in 2011, and it is called We'll Make It. And I'll invite you to pause on this and go through the different panels and have a look at the particular perspective that the viewer is invited to take on this dialogue between the woman and the man in their interior. And how you can see that at least once the perspective shifts. But you can also see that the perspective reveals a tabletop whose contents changes from bit to bit. And each panel thus features on the tabletop an array of perfectly delineated goods, designed goods. So they become almost like letters or words in an arbitrary, seemingly arbitrary alphabet that the viewer is invited to decipher, either through the meaning of these clearly delineated objects. I'm using the word clearly delineated because Joost Zwarte, in the tradition of the Franco-Belgian school, uses a technique that in comic book design is called ligne claire, the clear line, where the outline, especially the black outline of objects and characters in the comic book story is very much favored. And this can also be seen in another of Joost Zwarte's works. Here I have 3 independent panels, but connected through their focus on design. And certainly on the left, there's a clearly identifiable scene from the history of design. And for those of you who have done design histories as a lecture series and have been exposed, maybe in school, maybe through your first years at university, to the canonized history of Western design as modernism, will recognize not just the objects in the left panel, but maybe even the actors from the way in which they are caricatured, to belong to a particular design school and to a particular period of modernism. And this indeed, Joost Zwarte being Dutch and being very much knowledgeable about Dutch designers working at this particular design school, but also, as you may be seeing in the second panel or in the third, working in the tradition of this style, the kind of geometric ordering of the world on the picture plane, on the designed surface of the canvas or the paper, is of course somebody who knows this history of modernist Western design very well and can thus approach it in a kind of ironical way. You can also see, in a similar way to the previous comic strip for the New Yorker, in the right-hand panel, again the same perspective from up top in order to allow for a tabletop or the top of a refrigerator to act as a plane on which to place objects, or indeed the view out of the window where the square, the town square, becomes a plane in which different actors and different parts of design, in this case mobility and transport, can be depicted. So here, narratives and storylines. Another way of presenting a storyline is, of course, through moving images. And I'll invite you here to view a video that I personally like very much. It's by Akusa Adorno Owusu. She did it actually as a graduation project in 2007 when she graduated from a West Coast Design College in the US. And it's called Intermittent Delight. Here you can also see the installation of her film work, Intermittent Delight, at the McNay Art Museum in San Antonio, Texas, 2 years ago. And I would invite you, as before, to pause, watch the video, and then come back to it. And while you do so, maybe, again, consider certain questions, which, as said before, are not exhaustive, but might give you some suggestions of how to read, perceive the film while you're watching it. So maybe things to ponder are, what is the visual material being used? Because clearly there's a contrast, as you will see. So what are the sources? for these designed images. And how is Owusu combining these diverse sources? What's her technique in combining the media sources? And what does the composite medium of the film in combining these different media sources through a particular technique, as you will see, reveal about the changed meaning of the original media sources? What does she do? You know, does she subvert it? Does she celebrate it? What does she do with the found footage and with the self-generated footage that make parts of a film? Furthermore, looking at the McLuhan quote that we had before, what does this work demonstrate in terms of the change of scale, pace, or pattern that are introduced or are being introduced to understanding of culture and their interrelationship? What does this film say about the scale, pace, and pattern of design? So enjoy this film. As I said, it's a favorite of mine, and hopefully you will like it too. And then please come back to the presentation. So, another section concerns the mediation of design, the presentation in the media as material details. And in order to do this, I want to suggest a small visual quiz. So, please click manually and slowly through the next 7 slides. Pause on each one, if you will, and take a guess to what you're seeing. What is this a detail of? And what does the detail say about the following, the whole? And then, where do you think this piece of design might reside? What's the site of it? What does the material detail that you observe here say about the use and function of this piece of design? So, as you will see, the details are being presented in such a way that over the 7 slides you're zooming out. And the quiz, in a way, is a small challenge to you to say, when do you recognize what it might be? When are you in a position to have an educated guess, to say, this is what this is, and this is where this might be, in which geography, in which city, or further, and maybe prior to situating it, this might be the function of this. This is how I can use, as a user, as a consumer, this particular piece of design. So, maybe have fun with this short quiz. What I would suggest is that you go out of the slide presentation or you pause on each, because I will click through this now rather quickly, not giving you enough time, but you have to arrest each of the images manually in order to allow to process the information and have a guess around those. So there's 7, and when you come to the last one that is then captioned, it will reveal what it is. So I hope you indulge me. This was meant to be an entertaining exercise. Let's see how it works. Maybe take up the challenge and go slowly, arrest each image as you come across it, pause it, and take a guess. And then let's see how long it takes you to recognize what it actually is. Some of you might get it in the first or second slide. Hello, welcome back. So I'm joining you again with my voiceover for the seventh and final slide of the little quiz that gives you the caption, the makers of the designed work, and its title, and its site. And underneath is a link for those of you who find the project interesting and want to inquire more. Because as you might have realized by now, there is a very complex history behind this particular design. Architectural design, urban design, museum design, call it what you will. And that this particular history depends so much on the material detail, on the materiality of the components, on the way in which they're put together. And the link, but also your own research, will reveal what the ingenious use of the material is here and what it reveals both about the site for this design and its function, and how it, in a very progressive and self-critical way, reflected on the context of cultural production within its design. So the medium of architecture here, and the medium of photography to photograph this architecture, plays an important role, I would argue, to enhance the understanding of this work, which of course is best experienced when you're actually there, which regrettably I have not been able to do, and hopefully one day I will. But where a simple presentation of the overall image, as in this final seventh slide, might not actually reveal what you need to know, and a more detailed shot of the material being used for the design, without seeing the whole thing, actually tells you much more about the intentions of the two designers. A few more categories to finish off. Design is represented in the media as symbolic, as representative of use and consumption, most notably probably in advertising. The first example, though, does not necessarily come from advertising in the strictest sense, but is more an editorial in a magazine. And it shows the late Karl Lagerfeld, the designer that worked for the fashion house of Chanel, but also worked for Fendi on fur and furniture design and many other companies as a creative consultant, apart from also having his own clothing line and range of retail stores. And Lagerfeld was, like many designers, like many fashion designers, but maybe due to the longevity, I think he died at the ripe old age of 85 or 86 even, due to the longevity of his work and the longevity of his influence, and also the powerful position he occupied within the fashion industry or the culture industry at large through his role as chief designer for Chanel, he was able to present himself, to style himself as a piece of design, as an integral part of an overall aesthetic worldview, but an aesthetic worldview that is not conceived necessarily as in the Japanese example at the beginning, or in other examples you could think of, as an aesthetic worldview, as an understanding of form and space, but very much of an understanding of design as producing commodities, as stuff that you can buy and sell and brand. And this particular understanding of design as branded commodities is something that was very dear to him. He was very interested in selling a vision. And this vision changed from decade to decade, sometimes even within a decade. And as I said, one of the interesting aspects about Lagerfeld, in my view, is that he embodied those changes himself through his clothing, his physique, the way in which he held himself, his posture, his gestures, his interviews, his preferences in terms of food or in literature, films, and so on and so forth, which he dispensed with liberally, so that the media, both in terms of TV, radio, print media, but also the media in terms of visual media, could take part in each of these utterances and give room to each of the stylistic changes that he was embodying. And one of these examples, and you can see this always in the way in which he places himself in his interiors, was a succession of furnished apartments all around the world that he publicized in magazines as his latest stylistic interest. And here in 1981, he uses his apartment in Monaco as a showcase for Memphis Design, the Italian-based late 70s, early 80s design group. Alessandro Mendini, probably being one of the most, Ettore Sozzas, another one of the most prominent exponent of the Memphis Design Group. And you can see Lagerfeld here occupying an apartment that is not so much an apartment to live in or exist in, but a stylized assemblage of designed objects in which the designer himself is objectified as part of this overall design vision. More closely related to this idea of codes, visual codes, in design when presented in media as a form of consumed objects is straightforward advertising. And here you have an advertising campaign by DDB Stockholm, the ad agency in Sweden, for Diesel, northern Italian jeans manufacturer, fashion brand nowadays, and who in 2001, Renzo Russo being the head of Diesel at that point, embarking on a number of, controversial maybe is pushing it too far, a number of vaguely ironical and subversive image manipulation and advertising campaigns that clearly took its cue from the famous Benetton adverts from the 1970s and 1980s in terms of moving the contents of advertising clothes into a social realm where the advertising studio, the creative director at the brand agency, the designer himself may be more difficult in Benetton or Diesel because there's multinational conglomerates, had a role in shaping a social commentary. And here you had a series of works for Diesel that affected a reversal of the stereotypical relationship between the European continent or the North American continent and the African continent, in which the African continent was presented as an affluent, hedonistic, free living, free consuming continent that actually was so affluent and wealthy that it had to come to the aid of the impoverished Europeans and North Americans. And this was accompanied by models wearing, of course, Diesel denim. I let you ponder the reverse potential racism and the fact that a northern Italian designer and a Scandinavian ad agency ventures into this kind of territory, but maybe that's a moot point. The actual campaigns were relatively cleverly scripted and certainly in a very banal way, but still very effective, one could argue, revealed the stereotypes that, of course, most people in the West have of the African continent as being a place where aid needs to be expanded to in order to sustain it, which in economic terms doesn't make any sense, and any critical economist can unpack beautifully why Africa is not, as a continent, actually in need of aid, but that Western powers keep it that way. And these political, social, and economic conditions are here reversed and thus exposed. Finally, I said design can be represented in the media as a manual, as a functional cipher. And the manual, here an example of how to build the Star Wars Ultimate Millennium Falcon in Lego bricks, shows you a mediation of a design process as a functional recreation of the original. Somebody builds a particular piece of design from components, takes it apart, packages it, and sends it out with an instruction. And the user and consumer enjoys the designing game to a certain extent by recreating the work of the designer in a reduced form, by building the designed work up herself, themselves, or himself. And the same, of course, goes with the famous brand of IKEA that allows you to follow the manual in order to make sense of the sometimes very rudimentary instructions that come with a flat pack furniture. Of course, when the manual and the functional cipher in a design becomes iconic, as it is in IKEA, the ironic reversion or reversal or subversion is close at hand. And you can see on the right side the idea of tearing up one of the brochures, gluing it together, and making your own papier-mâché table out of not the flat pack furniture, but the actual instruction manual. You can see more of the parodies, even in an animated version, in the link that I provided below. So, these were some of the examples of how to see design in the media. And I want to conclude with another quote from Marshall McLuhan. If the formative power in the media are the media themselves, that raises a host of large matters that can only be mentioned here, although they deserve volumes. Namely, that technological media are staples or natural resources, exactly as are coal and cotton and oil. Anybody will concede that societies whose economies are dependent upon one or two major staples like cotton or grain or lumber or fish or cattle are going to have some obvious social patterns of organization as a result. Stress on a few major staples creates extreme instability in the economy, but great endurance in the population. The pathos and humor of the American South are embedded in such an economy of limited staples. Now, I'm not quite sure what McLuhan, as I said, a Canadian literary professor, means by the pathos of humor of the American South, whether he talks about South America as a continent or the South in the US, and what the pathos and humor in those particular cultures that often have extreme social and racial conflicts are, I cannot see. So I'm slightly critical about this, but maybe skip over this for the moment. Keep it in mind that this was written in 1964 by a white guy. But let's see. McLuhan continues, for a society configured by reliance on a few commodities, accepts them as a social bond quite as much as the metropolis does the press. Cotton and oil, like radio and TV, become fixed charges of the entire psychic life of the community. And this pervasive fact creates the unique cultural flavor of any society. It pays through the nose, society does, and all its other senses for each staple that shapes its life. So, Marshall McLuhan, here in 1964, defines media as a staple, as a natural resource. And of course, if you see today's economy, especially in North America and in China, those media companies that are in charge of gathering, distributing, processing, and consuming information are the most powerful one. Economic, but also social and political. So this idea that information media has become an absolute staple, especially in the extreme situation in which we find ourselves in now, is obvious. What is interesting is, to me, is that Marshall McLuhan makes a leap from staples like cotton, grain, lumber, fish, oil, and so on and so forth, that create particular patterns of consumption and production, talk about racism in the South, slavery, and so on and so forth in the South of the US, but that these patterns if taken over by media, where the staples are not oil or cotton or fish or lumber, but information, either through a visual medium like TV, a print medium like the newspaper, a hybrid medium like the internet, where these staples become absolutely prevalent, and it's hard to find a part of our globe where this is not the case, another type of pattern in the social relations emerge. So media, for McLuhan, and the interrelationship between different media is instrumental in creating social patterns and economic patterns. And this is part of the medium being the message. And this is why I think this essay of 1964 is still extremely relevant, and particularly in the given situation has become even more relevant. So I'll leave you to the recitations, where you might discuss this text and questions that arise from the presentation. And I very much thank you for your attention. Goodbye.